The last email she sent was not a goodbye. It wasn't a warning. It was filled with warmth, pride, and quiet hope, sent just hours before the world would learn that she and her husband were gone. That email wasn't written to family. It wasn't sent to Hollywood friends. It was sent to a man who has spent more than 3 decades behind prison walls, a death row inmate. And what that message reveals today changes how this entire story is understood. This story doesn't begin with tragedy. It begins in a theater. On December 12th in Los Angeles, Rob and Michele Reiner sat in the audience of an intimate stage production called Lyrics from Lockdown. It wasn't a traditional show. It was based on the life and writings of a man who couldn't be there, Nanon Williams. Williams has been incarcerated in Texas for more than 30 years. He was sentenced to death for a murder he has consistently maintained he did not commit, according to publicly available statements. That night, his story was alive on stage, and the Reiners weren't the only ones in the audience. Members of Williams' family were there, his mother, his siblings, and his wife, a woman he married while he was still incarcerated. The evening was meant to be a rare moment of connection, a moment not centered on courtrooms or verdicts, but on humanity, which is why what happened next carries a weight that's impossible to ignore. Because just hours later, while most people were asleep, an email was sent. An email that would only be read after it was already too late. The relationship between the Reiners and Nanon Williams wasn't symbolic. It wasn't distant. According to Williams, speaking in an interview with NBC News, they had become a meaningful part of his life. It began years earlier, in 2016, when the Reiners first saw Lyrics from Lockdown. According to accounts shared publicly, Rob Reiner was deeply affected by what he learned. The more he read about the case, the more questions he began to ask. Michele responded differently, more quietly, more gently, but no less powerfully. Williams later described it this way: the more upset Rob became, the more loving Michele became. That balance shaped everything that followed, but their connection didn't fully deepen until technology crossed prison walls. In 2021, Williams was issued a state-approved tablet allowing limited communication. That changed everything. Emails became regular, messages became personal, and Michele, according to Williams, wrote most often. Not as an activist, not as a public figure, but as someone who asked simple questions. How are you today? How is your mother? How are you holding up? Williams later said something striking. Michele was my heart. Through scheduled video calls, he was introduced to the Reiners' children, Jack, Romy, and Nick. According to Williams, he felt only warmth and kindness from the family, nothing that suggested what was coming. And then came December 13th, the night after the show. At 8:36 p.m., Michele sent an email. She wrote about the performance, about how meaningful it was, about seeing Williams' family in the audience. She mentioned how beautiful his mother was. She said she must have done something right, because of the man her son became. She spoke about watching the show together one day, and as she always did, she ended the message the same way. Hope you're doing well. Love you, Michele. That email would sit unread for days, because prison emails are delayed, reviewed, filtered, and when Williams finally opened his tablet, it wasn't that message he saw first. It was the news. When Williams opened his state-issued tablet, he wasn't looking for headlines. He was checking messages. Instead, he was met with news reports stating that Rob and Michele Reiner had been found deceased in their Los Angeles home, and that their son, Nick Reiner, had been charged in connection with their deaths, according to publicly available information. For Williams, the moment was disorienting. He immediately wrote back to Michele. "Please, this can't be true," he wrote. "Please tell me the news is lying." It was a message that would never be answered. At that point, he had no way of knowing that the email she had sent days earlier, full of warmth and encouragement, was already waiting in the system, delayed by routine prison review. Two messages moving in opposite directions, one filled with hope, one filled with disbelief. They would never meet in time. But to understand why this loss resonated so deeply, you have to understand who the Reiners were and why this case mattered to them. Rob and Michele Reiner were widely known for their involvement in social justice causes. They supported initiatives focused on fairness, rehabilitation, and accountability within the legal system. Their interest in Williams' case wasn't casual. Williams was charged with murder in 1992 when he was 17 years old. In 1995, he was sentenced to death for the killing of 19-year-old Adonis Collier, who was fatally shot during an incident in a Houston park. According to court records and reporting by NBC News, Williams admitted to firing a gun during the altercation, but maintained that he did not fire the fatal shot. Another individual involved in the incident, Val Guevara, also fired a weapon and later testified against Williams as part of a plea agreement with the state. The conviction relied heavily on ballistic evidence presented at trial. Years later, that evidence would come into question. And when the evidence began to unravel, the story took a very different turn. According to publicly available court documents, the ballistic expert, whose testimony played a key role in Williams's conviction, later informed prosecutors that his original conclusion had been incorrect. In subsequent filings, prosecutors opposing Williams' parole in 1999 acknowledged that Guevara had been very evasive and apparently not at all truthful while testifying. In 2001, a state judge conducted post-conviction hearings and determined that Williams was entitled to a new trial. That recommendation, however, was ultimately rejected by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Legally, the sentence remained, but morally and emotionally, questions remained open. For the Reiners, those questions mattered, and Michele, in particular, never stopped reaching out. Williams has described Michele as a constant presence during some of his darkest moments. She didn't promise outcomes. She didn't make declarations. She listened. She encouraged. She reminded him that he was seen. She shared stories from her own life, asked about his family, celebrated small moments. According to Williams, her messages made the isolation of incarceration more bearable, which is why the delayed email, the one sent the night after the show, carries such emotional weight. It wasn't just a recap of a performance. It was proof that, until the very end, Michele believed in connection over distance, compassion over despair, and her family would later echo that same spirit. In a statement shared with NBC News, the Reiners' daughter, Romy, reflected on the bond her parents formed with Williams. "My parents spoke about him with such love," she said. "He has taught me more about life and human compassion than anyone I've ever met." It was a reminder that this story was never about headlines. It was about people. And yet, one question still lingers. How does a message filled with kindness become someone's final memory of a person they never met in freedom? And what does that say about the lasting impact of human connection, even in the most restricted places? On the surface, Michele Reiner's final email reads like a simple message, a kind note, a reflection on a meaningful evening. But in context, it became something more. It captured a moment where art, justice, and empathy quietly intersected. A reminder that connection doesn't require proximity, only intention. For Williams, that email wasn't just delayed correspondence. It was confirmation that someone on the outside still saw him as a whole person, not as a case number, not as a headline, but as someone worthy of care. And this is where the story moves beyond loss and into understanding. Cases like Williams highlight how complex the justice system can be, especially when early evidence later comes into question. Regardless of where people stand on individual cases, one truth remains consistent. Human dignity doesn't disappear at sentencing. The Reiners never claimed to have all the answers. They asked questions, they listened, and they chose compassion. That choice, repeated quietly over years of emails and conversations, may be their most enduring legacy. Because even after they were gone, their words continued to move. When Williams finally read Michele's message, it was already part of the past. Yet, its meaning lived in the present. In a system built around waiting, that email became a reminder that not all delays erase impact. Some messages arrive exactly when they're needed, even if they arrive too late to be answered. Lyrics from Lockdown was never designed to shock. It wasn't built to provoke outrage or force conclusions. According to publicly available descriptions, it was meant to do something quieter, to translate the inner world of incarceration into words that could be felt, not judged. For Rob and Michele Reiner, the show wasn't entertainment. It was a window, a way to understand how a single life can be shaped and limited by decisions made decades earlier, sometimes under circumstances that remain debated long after a verdict is reached. That understanding is what kept them involved long after the applause faded, because for the Reiners, the story didn't end when the curtain closed. Many people feel moved by a cause in the moment. Few stay. According to Williams, the Reiners continued learning about his case years after first encountering his work. They asked questions. They read documents. They followed developments closely. Not because they believed they could control the outcome, but because they believed attention itself mattered. Rob Reiner, by Williams's account, grew increasingly frustrated as inconsistencies became clearer to him. Michele responded by leaning further into personal connection. Two different reactions, one shared purpose, and that balance shaped the tone of every message Michele sent. Michelle's emails were never dramatic. They didn't dwell on despair. They focused on presence. She talked about everyday life, family moments, things that reminded Williams the world was still moving and that he still belonged to it. That final email followed the same pattern. She didn't frame the night at the theater as a victory. She framed it as something they experienced together, even across distance. That detail matters because it shows intent, not to rescue, but to include. And inclusion, in places defined by isolation, carries unusual weight. Time moves differently inside prison. Days are structured, weeks blur, years stretch. Communication is filtered, delayed, and limited. So when an email arrives, it isn't just information. It's interruption, a reminder of the outside world pressing gently against the walls. For Williams, Michele's messages were that interruption, which is why reading the news first, before reading her email, created such a stark emotional contrast. One message described loss, The other described love. Both were true, but only one had a voice, and that contrast forces a deeper reflection. It's important to be clear about what this story does not do. It does not resolve Williams's case. It does not override legal decisions. It does not offer conclusions where courts have not. What it does offer is context. A look at how people on the outside choose to engage with systems that feel distant, complex, and often overwhelming. The Reiners didn't position themselves as judges. They positioned themselves as listeners. And listening, in this case, created a legacy that outlived them. Much of what Michele did will never be public. Most of her emails were private. Most of her support happened quietly. There were no cameras, no speeches, no statements meant for attention, just consistency. In a culture that often equates impact with visibility, her approach stands out, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. And that steadiness shaped how others saw her too. Romy Reiner's statement reflects a broader truth about Michele's character. Compassion wasn't something she performed. It was something she practiced. The way she spoke about Williams at home, according to Romy, reflected genuine respect and care, not obligation. That consistency between private and public life is rare, and it helps explain why this email carries such significance now, because sometimes a single document becomes a symbol. The email matters not because it was final, but because it was ordinary. It shows how Michele lived, engaged, thoughtful, present. In stories shaped by extreme circumstances, it's often the ordinary details that resonate the longest. A kind sentence, a familiar sign-off, a simple expression of care. Those details don't fade with headlines. There is a reason stories like this linger. They don't rely on shock. They rely on contrast, freedom and confinement, public life and private messages, a crowded theater and a silent prison cell. The human brain is naturally drawn to these opposites, not to judge them, but to reconcile them. That tension keeps people watching. But the most compelling element here isn't the setting. It's the emotional continuity. Most relationships are shaped by proximity. This one was shaped by consistency. Williams and Michele did not share a physical space. They shared time, email by email, year by year. That rhythm created familiarity, something rare in environments designed to separate. And familiarity is what makes the final email feel unfinished, because unfinished stories naturally invite reflection. Psychologists often note that final messages take on added meaning, not because of their content, but because of their position in time. Michele's email wasn't written as a farewell. That's what gives it its power. It wasn't shaped by fear or anticipation. It was shaped by normalcy, which makes it feel honest. And honesty, more than drama, creates emotional impact that lasts. That impact extended beyond Williams. The Reiners' involvement didn't just affect one person. Their support amplified attention toward a story that might otherwise have remained limited to legal filings and transcripts. By attending the show, by talking about it, by staying engaged, they helped translate a single case into a broader conversation about fairness, empathy, and accountability. Not through confrontation, but through curiosity. And curiosity is what drives meaningful change. Many discussions around incarceration become polarized quickly. People feel pressured to choose sides. The Reiners took a different path. They acknowledged complexity. They allowed uncertainty. They stayed open. That approach didn't demand agreement. It invited understanding. And understanding, even without consensus, is powerful. especially when it survives loss. The news of Rob and Michele Reiner's deaths was shocking to many, but for Williams, it was deeply personal. According to his account, he had lost not advocates, but family. That distinction matters. Advocacy can end. Connection doesn't. The email became a reminder that relationships formed in unlikely places can carry just as much meaning as those formed anywhere else. And meaning is what gives stories endurance. Viewers don't stay for resolution here, because there isn't one. They stay for insight. They stay to understand how compassion operates within systems that often feel impersonal. They stay because the story respects their intelligence, offering context instead of conclusions. That respect builds trust, and trust builds retention. Which brings us to the question this story quietly asks. If one person's steady kindness can echo across decades and walls, what unseen impact do ordinary actions have in everyday life? That question doesn't demand an answer. It invites thought. And thought is what keeps people coming back. Beyond the personal connection between Williams and the Reiners, this story exists in a wider social and cultural framework. It highlights the human element in discussions of justice, how public figures can influence awareness without sensationalism, the subtle power of empathy over publicity. The Reiners were well-known Hollywood figures, but their actions weren't about fame. They were about witnessing a life unfold and choosing to care consistently. This reminds audiences that impactful stories don't need to be loud. Sometimes quiet observation and steady engagement matter most. And that quiet power is what makes stories like this suitable for binge watching. Viewers return not for shock, but for understanding. The delayed email stands as a symbol that small gestures of kindness can resonate far beyond immediate circumstances, that understanding someone's life requires more than headlines, that emotional bonds can form in the most unexpected places. Williams' account and the Reiners' consistent engagement remind us that meaningful human connection does not require proximity, and impact does not require dramatic events. Because connection is a story people want to follow to the end and beyond. By the time viewers reach the end of this story, they're not left with a cliff of fear or suspense. They're left with reflection. Reflection on the importance of empathy, the consequences of delayed communication, how quiet, consistent attention can shape someone's life. This payoff is subtle. It is respectful. And it is emotionally satisfying without sensationalizing tragedy, which brings us naturally to the next narrative step. The story doesn't conclude with a single email or a single tragedy. Next, we explore lyrics from Lockdown in depth, how Williams' writings translated incarceration into a universal human experience, why stories like this continue to captivate audiences and spark conversations about justice, accountability, and empathy. By framing it this way, viewers are encouraged to continue watching, not out of fear, but out of genuine curiosity and a desire to understand. If you want to see how words written behind bars reached far beyond prison walls, and how a single performance can influence lives in ways even the creators might never anticipate, the next video dives straight into that story. No sensationalism, no forced drama, just context, insight, and the continuation of a story that began with one email and grew into something profoundly human. This story isn't about assigning blame. It isn't about speculation. It's about how a single act of kindness can resonate across years, walls, and circumstances. and it raises a broader question worth thinking about. How many lives are quietly shaped by people we never meet in person? In the next video, we take a deeper look at lyrics from lockdown, how one man's words reached beyond prison walls, and why stories like this continue to challenge how we think about justice, redemption, and empathy. If you want to understand the full impact behind that final email, that's where the story continues.